Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location, and I'm here, as so often, my good friend and colleague Rachel Person from Northshire's Saratoga Springs location. We've got a great event tonight. I've been really looking forward to it, but just a few quick things before we hand it over to Rachel to introduce our presenters. Please, at any time tonight, type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can click on it, Q&A button, and we'll save those up for you and pose them at the Q&A at the end of the evening. And finally, it's a note of thanks. It's never been an easy job to be an independent bookseller, and the last couple of years particularly so. So we have a great deal of thanks to give to all of you who have supported us through this time. So thanks so much. Rachel, please get started.
Thank you, David. I'm so very pleased to get to welcome Benjamin Bogin to our screens this evening. He's a scholar of Himalayan Buddhism and is the director of the Asian Studies program at Skidmore College. He's the author of The Illuminated Life of the Great Yalmoa, which he presented in person at Northshire Saratoga back when it first came out. He's with us tonight to discuss How the Swans Came to the Lake, which was written by his uncle, Rick Fields. The book has just been re-released as a special 40th anniversary edition with an introduction by Dr. Bogin. He is joined tonight by James Shaheen, the editor-in-chief of Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, an independent quarterly magazine that presents Buddhist wisdom and practices from a number of traditions to a Western audience. He's particularly interested in Buddhism's growth in the West and its applicability to Western politics, culture, and everyday life. Please join me in welcoming them to our screen this evening.
Well, thank you to Northshire Books. Thank you, Daphne, and thank you, Rachel. Hi, Rick.
Oh, Ben.
I'm sorry, I called you Rick. You guys do look alike. Hi, Ben.
Hi, James. Thanks so much for joining this event tonight.
And you kind of look like Rick's incarnation. So, okay. I wondered if we could start by hearing a little bit about Rick and your relationship to Rick and the kind of man he was.
Of course. Rick was my maternal uncle, my mother's older brother. And when this book first came out, How the Swans Came to the Lake, I was 6 years old. And I was just astonished by the fact that someone I was related to had written a book that was published. And that was very exciting to me. Of course, I wasn't quite able to read the book at that time. But I remember spending many hours flipping through the photographs of all of these really pioneers of Buddhism in America and becoming familiar with their faces and their style of dress and all of those things. And so at that time, Rick lived in the West Coast and I lived in the Northeast, and we didn't see much of him in my childhood aside from a few big events, but he was sort of this mythical family figure who had traveled to Asia and had a guru and wrote poetry and books. And I admired him really deeply before I even really came to know him. And then in my teen years, as I was going through some period of radical growth and experimentation, my parents, I think, didn't quite know what to do with me and asked Rick to kind of check in on me and see how I was doing. And so I ended up actually hitchhiking out to Boulder, Colorado, where he lived at the time, and spending some time with him the summer that I turned 18. And we became, quite close from that time. And then a year later, I was a student on a study abroad program in India, and Rick came to India, and we traveled together and met the Tibetan Buddhist teacher that he was studying with, Chatrul Sanjay Dorje Rinpoche. And together, Rick and I, traveled and performed a pilgrimage in Sikkim and became very, very close. Not very long after that, he was diagnosed with cancer and spent the next many years sort of fighting the cancer, going to remission. He also, during that time, wrote a beautiful book of poems called Fuck You, Cancer, and other poems that he published as a chapbook. And up until his death in 1999, I was very close with him during that whole period. So that's, in very brief sort of outline of my personal relationship with him.
Yeah, I remember how impressed I was when Helen Tworkov, the magazine's founder, published "Fuck You, Cancer" pieces from it, and it was caused somewhat of a stir. I just think maybe the word, I don't know, is really great. I guess it's fair to say that he created the framework in which we're even having this discussion. How is it, first of all, to critique your own uncle's work? In fact, he used some of his own critical tools to do that. Was there some ambivalence or discomfort?
Yeah, this reissue sort of came about from a series of conversations I had with Nico Odysseus, who's the publisher of Shambhala Publications, who initially published the book 40 years ago. And at first we were talking about trying to revise and update the book to account for everything that's happened in American Buddhism in the 40 years since then. And I spent over a year, thinking about how I might possibly do that. And it was both a very humbling experience, because I realized in a new way just what an extraordinary book this was as a piece of writing and as a document. And also how impossible it would be to sort of continue the same story through the last 40 years, just because Buddhism has become part of the kind of fabric of American culture in a way that it really wasn't back then. And the book introduces dozens of really extraordinary characters, but if you were to try and carry on from the 1980s when that started to today, there are literally thousands of people you would need to sort of account for. So I finally kind of gave up on that, and we settled on the idea of, the more I read it, the more I also saw the book as really a classic within the sort of a broader framework of Buddhist historiography, of stories that Buddhists tell throughout the world about how Buddhism came to their land. Because, of course, Buddhism developed in, what's now India, but then each time it traveled, whether to Sri Lanka or to China or to Tibet or to Japan, histories were written, stories were told about how the teachings arrived there. And so this book, I think, is as close as we have to an American version of that story, the story of how Buddhism arrived in America. And reading it, I thought it would be really wrong to change the text, to change anything there. And rather, I offered to write an essay, an introductory essay that would frame the book and reflect on it from today's perspective. And that did involve significant amount of critique, because there are certain aspects of the book, as deeply as I admire and love it, that were it written today, and I would suggest even if Rick were alive to write it today, he would write it differently in some sense. We have a much greater awareness now of the legacy of white supremacy and patriarchy in the way that we imagine American history, in the way that we imagine Buddhist history. We have a much better understanding of some of the problems that American Buddhist communities in the 70s and 80s experienced, and unfortunately continue to experience today. And those things are not quite present in the surface of the text in the way that they would be had it been written now rather than 40 years earlier. So how to hold both of those things at the same time, my admiration and respect and a genuine sense that there's a lot to be learned from reading this book today, with the fact that I also wanted to try and critique some of the things in the book that do seem to be a marker of its age from 40 years ago, and some of the limitations that were in place then.
Well, you wrote a long introduction, and it's very readable. It's a lovely read, so you have something in common with your uncle. But I'd like to get to the type of history it is, but before that, I'd like to point something else out. You mentioned that it defined American Buddhism as a subject, that How the Swans Came to the Lake defined American Buddhism as a subject. And you said it's one book that really provides a portrait that creates a space for American Buddhism. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, one way that this book is quite different from the other kinds of Buddhist histories I mentioned, like the Buddhist histories written in Sri Lanka or in Tibet or in China, those histories, they don't really conceive of Tibetan Buddhism or Sri Lankan Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism as distinct. They just talk about Buddhism. This book, part of what's different about it is it's really making the case for the existence and the unique nature of American Buddhism. as a place where the tremendous diversity of all the Buddhist traditions that arrived here could sort of be in an experimental space where they could develop into something quite new and something quite unique. And there are moments in the book, I think, where there's an almost sort of aspirational sense in which the arrival of Buddhism in America can allow for America to fulfill its own aspirations and for Buddhism to fulfill its own aspirations in the contemporary world in a contemporary way. And that's something I think that I really see in Rick's writing, in his voice, is that he sees, he describes the arrival of Buddhism in America as a kind of a homecoming. Which is an interesting way of thinking about it. You know, it seems it's traveled very far from its origins, but as a place where certain Buddhist ideals have a great opportunity to really take root and flourish. And that's something that I think he voiced very strongly there.
Yeah, I can see how it's different from traditional Buddhist histories. And you also point out that it's at the same time very different from a critical historian's history, and one that you might write, say. How is it different?
Well, you know, Rick himself was, involved with the arrival of Buddhism in America in a very direct way, right? He studied with many of the Buddhist teachers who are profiled in the book, and had a quite eclectic approach to Buddhist practice himself. So he had a sort of principal teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, but he also studied widely in the Zen tradition with some of the most important Zen teachers of that time. And he would really, sort of meditate with anyone in any style, in any tradition. He didn't at all have a sort of dogmatic sense of there's only one way. And in some of his poetry, he also pokes fun at this sort of closed-minded view that there's only one correct path, and that can be a sort of egocentric trap. He really was open to exploring all of these different traditions in different ways. So the book is written really from the perspective of a participant, but he took, journalism and the ethics of journalism very seriously. And so it's not, an autobiographical book. There's no, he doesn't really talk about his own life. I provide a short biography in the introduction, but in the book itself, Rick is really focused on the subjects. But he doesn't disguise the fact that he is telling the story of a lineage that he is a part of, right? And Buddhist history really ultimately is the story of lineage. How do you connect the dots from yourself and your own meditation cushion to your teacher and your teacher's teacher, all the way back to the Buddha? And that's what this book does. And Rick is writing from his own place, talking about his own teachers and their teachers traced back all the way. So it's not a history, written by an academic historian. It's not an academic work, and it has a liveliness about it. As a reader, I find that you feel like the person who's telling you the story has direct access to the story itself, right? That he's there, even when he's talking about things hundreds of years before he was born. That sense of lineage and the continuity of lineage enlivens the narrative throughout.
It's a great read. I recommend it to everyone. I really like the statement that Buddhist history is more like freshly baked bread, not so much the recipe. So why don't you say something about that? It was a very nice way of putting it.
Yeah, so maybe I'll even just read that little passage, because Rick's words there are, I think, better than a paraphrase that I could come up with. He says, Buddhist history is the record of lineage, of who gave what to whom, not as dead doctrine, but as living truth. It is more a matter of the freshly baked bread than of the recipe. And he goes on to say, the lineage is chronological and linear, or seems to be, and the story has gone on for 2,500 years. Buddhism insists on the primacy of the present. Zen masters sometimes talk about locking eyebrows with the ancient patriarchs. And it is in this sense that history, or at least Buddhist history, is never out of date. And that section in particular, as I was thinking about how to bring this book up to date, and I looked at his own words in the author's note at the beginning of the earlier edition, and it was as if Rick was speaking to me very directly through his own written words and saying, there's a sense in which Buddhist history is never out of date. And so my attempt in the introduction was how to hold to that as one true way of understanding the book and understanding Buddhist history, and also recognizing that there are aspects of it that do seem out of date in certain ways, right? So how can it be both? How can there be an element that's still alive and is never out of date and is about immediacy and presence? And how are there other ways in which the story of Buddhism in America looks different in 2022 than it did 40 years earlier?
I would be remiss not to mention that Rick had everything to do with the founding of Tricycle. He really laid the groundwork for that to happen. And he really made a space not only for Buddhism as a topic, but also for Buddhist journalism. Maybe we wouldn't have Buddhist journalism as we have it today if it hadn't been for people like Rick or Katie Butler, and there's a bit of a list, but he was certainly preeminent among equals, probably, or first among equals. You say the book is as much about America as it is about Buddhism. How so?
Well, the book in the part one of the book really traces the story from the Buddha's enlightenment, which Rick saw as the necessary beginning for any Buddhist history, that it has to begin with the story of the Buddha's enlightenment. And it goes through the development of Buddhism in Asia in a brief sketch, and then the interactions between European scholars, the great Sanskritists of the colonial period, and scholars and Buddhist practitioners in Asia, all the way up to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. And that's a sort of turning point when, after that moment, you start to have Buddhists arriving, Buddhist teachers arriving from Asia and teaching widely throughout the United States. So it's particularly in the second half of the book, but even some of those 19th century figures, the Theosophists, we have very interesting connections to the spiritualist movement, which in upstate New York was a hotbed of those activities, and all the way up through the Concord Circle figures. And so you really do learn a lot from reading the book about the role that Buddhism played in formative moments in 19th century American history, whether the Transcendentalists or the Theosophists, and how influential many of those ideas were in different areas of political life, also in America, the abolitionist movement and elsewhere. And then part two, you really start to see a lot about the history of the countercultural movements of the 1960s, everything that led up to that, the Beat generation, and how that sort of played such a strong role in imagining alternatives to the sort of religious frameworks that American society operated within. And so it's very rich in terms of providing portraits of that time period in American life that was so transformative.
I just want to go back to a moment to updating the book or explaining it through the lens of the present without judging it. How we define American Buddhism has evolved as decades pass, and it was left to you. The task of correction was left to you, and clearing up the inevitable misconceptions, social, political, scholarly. Can you talk a little bit more about that in detail, like the looking at something through the lens of the present, something that was written 40 years ago that was inevitably partial in the information available, as it is today?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, these, so the present in which I was writing the introduction really was a present, it was the early in the coronavirus pandemic, late in the Trump presidency, a moment when America was erupting into widespread demonstrations in the streets against police brutality and structural racism in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So I, along with every thinking person, was really re-examining the impact of racism in American history and in our lives as I was writing this. And there are many ways in which I think the biggest critique that I would make of the book today is that it privileges white male actors, right? So there are male Asian teachers, and predominantly they're male white students. And it marginalizes the contributions of Asian American communities to the history of Buddhism in America. They appear, there's a chapter early in part 1, chapter 3 or 4, where we're introduced to Buddhism that came to America with immigrants from Asia. But those communities largely fade to the margins of the story until much later in the book. And so this is a history of American Buddhism that foregrounds converts to Buddhism, not people who brought Buddhism with them as part of their family tradition. And one way of thinking about that also is that it's a story of American Buddhism that begins on the East Coast with the Concord Circle and the Transcendentalists, and then slowly, moves across America to the West. Whereas, we might be better, more accurate historically to begin the story in the Pacific, in California, with the immigrants from China and Japan and Korea, who then brought Buddhism with them and established Buddhist temples and communities in California, and that slowly moved from the West to the East. So there's a way in which the very structure of the book sort of replicates this privileging of the experience of white Americans. So that became very clear to me. As I was thinking about how to write about that, I also really thought a lot about my uncle, and he actually published 2 essays later in life, much after this book was published. One in your magazine, in Tricycle, that was called "Confessions of a White Buddhist: Diversity, Race, Diversity, Dharma, and Race." Right, and that's a really extraordinary essay, and to me that was a map for how to address some of these questions. It was, again, I felt as if Rick had left this gift behind of saying, these are some of my thoughts about these issues. And that was in, I think, 1993, that essay was published.
93, I think. Yeah, it was early. It's early if you consider, how long it took for that to be taken up.
Yeah, exactly. It was early in terms of the American Buddhist community confronting racism. It was far too late in terms of the reality of, how long, when it should have been confronted. But in that essay, he says, racism has always been the nightmare squatting at the heart of the American dream. And, in the biography of him, I mentioned, this is someone, his actual name was Frederick Douglass Fields. And he writes about an experience he had growing up in Queens, at his elementary school, where after class, one of his teachers, who happened to be a Black social science teacher, said to him, "Your name's Frederick Douglass?" And she said, I've taught plenty of kids named after George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but I've never had a white kid named after a Black leader. And he described his sort of sense of pride in that moment, but also a sense that there was a way in which he had this privilege as someone who, was seen as white, that he could, he didn't have to disclose that if he wanted. And he also joked, his parents left the second S off the name Douglas. And he said that his father used to joke and say, well, I thought I'd just put with one S. So if you wanted to, you could tell people you were named after General MacArthur instead. So, this is something that was a part of his life from early on. And I think it's important to critique the ways in which the book, doesn't adequately reflect the importance and the experience of particularly Asian American communities, but also just the entire diverse world of American Buddhism. And at the same time, recognize that Rick was sort of a pioneer in trying to bring these issues into discussion and confront them and approach them. And so that made it easier to bring those criticisms there, because I felt like he was already doing that in a sense, particularly in that 1993 essay where he addressed some of those.
Right. It's really a matter of how we defined American Buddhism. I mean, if you read Duncan Williams's American Sutra, you can see in the internment camps that an American Buddhism had already emerged. And in the crucible of the camps, that became, very, very obvious. But it's just a question of really, in part, a bias toward the stream of Buddhism that came in from the East Coast as opposed to the West, and of course racism, or kind of the invisibility, say, of the Asian American Buddhists who'd already been practicing something we could easily call American Buddhism. After all, it had adapted to their new home. So at the same time, the book is such a wonderful read, and the introduction is lovely. And I still think it's a very, very relevant book to Buddhism in this country. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you consider it still relevant despite the particulars of the time in which it was written?
Yeah. So in connection with that question, there's one piece of related to the previous question as well. In talking about sort of two different kinds of American Buddhism, which is really an oversimplification, but I think perhaps a helpful one. There's a sense in which the sort of convert tradition of Buddhism has really always emphasized the practice of meditation and the study of Buddhist philosophy as the kind of hallmarks of what Buddhism is about and what it means to be Buddhist. Whereas the immigrant Buddhist communities, there's been, as you would expect, more of an emphasis on community-based activities, on ritual, on aspects of religious life as we understand it all over the place, right? A lot of converts to Buddhism, I think, made that transition more palatable by imagining that Buddhism was somehow not a religion, or that they were interested in the aspects that were not religious, right? And there's a sort of process of secularization that has happened with Buddhism in the United States. And, maybe one of the more visible examples of that is mindfulness meditation in its, really secularized form in all of our, schools and hospitals and workplaces and all those different things. So Rick was very interested in the differences between these. And at one point, if I might just read one more passage actually from Rick's essay about Confessions of a White Buddhist, where he talks about sort of a vision of bringing these two streams of Buddhism in America together, and what that would look like. So he describes that if convert Buddhists could learn from the example of these non-monastic Buddhist communities exemplified for him by the Japanese Pure Land traditions. Rick wrote, such a Buddhism would continue to provide a safe haven for ethnic Buddhist communities from a beleaguered Asia, as well as an experimental crucible for creative and effective adaptations, and would give us all the chance to create a truly liberating, multicultured, many-hued, shifting, shimmering, pure land of American Buddhism. So there's a sort of aspiration in his 1993 essay, Confessions of a White Buddhist. That to me relates to one of the reasons I think it's still valuable to read this book today, right? He talks about Buddhist history as a kind of a mirror. He quotes this Zen idea of locking eyebrows with the patriarchs, right? And it's in a sense when we look at our ancestors as reflections of ourselves, right? Who could we be at our best when we look with admiration at our ancestors? And also, what things do we need to change, right? So there's a way in which anyone who's interested in Buddhism in America today, I think, needs to know the story. They need to know the story of how Buddhism came here in order to have some sense of what Buddhism in America means, and including the limitations in terms of how that story was told 40 years ago, and also the sort of opportunities that were envisioned there that are not yet fulfilled, right? So there's a lot in this book that I see as sort of a map of the past, and there's a lot that's an aspiration for the future. And I think in the sort of present moment in between those two, we can really ask very meaningful and important questions of ourselves with this book as a guide in that sense. So to me, that's the most important role the book has to play today, is it provides a sort of a mirror in some way.
You know, even this notion of the two Buddhisms, though, of course, became very problematic. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I said briefly, this is a vast oversimplification, and of course, it really is exaggerated. As with all binaries, you end up, making it sound as if one side excludes the other, and that's not at all the case. This is just a sort of a tool for thinking about ways that Buddhism has been conceptualized in different ways. But the Asian American Buddhist communities have been very philosophically robust and engaged with meditation in different ways. And convert Buddhists are involved with community and ritual in different ways. It's just sort of a matter of emphasis in the way that it looked, at least at that time.
Right. It's sort of interesting. There were some European American Pure Land Buddhists, like Goldwater's brother or cousin, who was involved in pushing back against the internment camps, which I found very interesting. I didn't know that until Duncan's book. But one of the things that really appealed to the convert communities was meditation. I mean, because meditation was central to the Buddhism that they understood and internalized. And when they looked at other traditions like Shin Buddhism, and they saw that the primary practice or the centered practice was the Nembutsu, or like the chant, as really a kind of meditation. Frankly, I interviewed Tai Uno today. They were presumptuous enough to think that that's not really Buddhism.
Yeah. And
that's pretty appalling when you look at it that way. But I have to say that Rick was sort of onto this as soon as he came across something like that. Immediately responded, as he did in that article in 1993. You say it's late. Well, it's late when people are suffering, yes. But it was early if you consider his colleagues at the time. For instance, absolutely. Yeah, and he was also willing to look at the sex scandals in the Buddhist communities, and Ozel Tenzin was an example. I mean, he resigned. Do you want to talk about that? He was very ethical.
Yeah, I think that's something. So that was one of the more challenging parts of the introduction to write is, this is the fourth edition of How the Swans Came to the Lake. The first two editions were the same. In the third edition, he added a new chapter. And that chapter was an attempt in part to address some of the scandals that had rocked the American Buddhist world in the 80s and early 90s. And he, at least one reviewer really critiqued him quite strongly for not condemning outright some of the figures involved in those scandals, but presenting kind of a balanced picture of both sides and leaving it for the reader to decide what to do with that. And so I thought about that critique very seriously, and the fact is that when we look today at the number of scandals of abuse, whether financial impropriety or sexual abuse within American Buddhist communities, we see that the author of that review was correct to say this is a far bigger problem than you're making out here, and something we really need to address. At the same time, I went through, as part of the research for this, I read lots of the documents that Rick had left behind, and that included his correspondence with the directors of the Buddhist organization he was most closely affiliated with and employed by, and the particular scandal that he was the closest to. And in those letters, one of which I reproduce in the introduction, it's crystal clear that in his private correspondence, he was very outspoken, speaking out against abuse and the systems that enabled that abuse to continue. And he resigned from his position as the editor of the Vajradhatu Sun, so he sacrificed his own livelihood really on that ethical question around that. And it's chilling actually to read that letter, because he says, if we don't all wake up and become more transparent about these things, this is going to fester for decades. And sadly, today, these words read as quite prophetic in terms of, some of these situations in American Buddhist communities. So I again, looking at all of the available evidence, I came to see his added chapter to the third edition of the book as that he saw, well, this isn't the place in how the swans came to the lake. This is a history of Buddhism in America. It's not the place for me to kind of grind my axe about, my view of this. I'm going to present the different perspectives of what happened here and leave it to the reader to decide. And I understand, some people may still see that as the wrong choice, but in the context of his, personal sacrifices in other areas, I see that as, making sense within the sort of journalistic framework that he was working in that book, and how he, really did make personal sacrifices to protect, vulnerable members of his own Buddhist community, and make sure that the truth was spoken. So just to flesh that out a little bit, so it doesn't seem all ambiguous, this particular scandal was the regent who had been appointed by Trungpa Rinpoche, Rick's teacher, was HIV positive and was concealing that fact from the general public while continuing to have sexual relations with many, many different members of the community. And Rick insisted that be made public, that announcement be made public. And when the board blocked him, issued a gag order in effect, he resigned and published in a letter to the editor, because he was no longer the editor, an announcement that was the first public acknowledgement of that fact from within the community. It had already been actually reported in the New York Times and Los Angeles Times and elsewhere, but the first internal recognition of that widely reported fact.
Well, that's actually what the Buddhist community struggled with. Not so much stories being leaked to the mainstream press, which they didn't necessarily appreciate, but being able to look at their own community honestly and frankly, and discussing it openly. The cost of doing that could be very high, as Katie Butler discovered when she wrote about Dick Baker and the scandal at San Francisco Zen Center. It alienated her from her Dharma brothers and sisters, the people at her Sangha and her teacher and so forth. So the risk in doing that was very, very high. Helen Torkov, the founder of Tricycle, discovered that herself when she published things that were unpopular. Things have changed now. So it's interesting looking at something from 40 years ago, because there's no need to excuse anybody or exonerate anybody, but to look at the choices they made under the conditions in which they made them is important, because you risked your career. He lost his job, basically. They fired him and then he resigned, to make a statement. And it was a strong one. But back then, how the culture itself was dealing with women's issues, with sexual abuse, and certainly with AIDS, as it ends in infecting at least one student. Dealing with that, he did pretty bravely, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, giving up the job is one thing, but more painful in a sense was the rupture with his community. I mean, that was, he really felt that throughout his life, there was a pain associated with that loss and that rupture. And I think he never doubted that was the right choice, but a sense of being somewhat exiled from the community that had really been his home for decades was a very painful experience.
Right, he pointed to the elephant in the middle of the room.
Yeah.
So there was a price to pay for that. Is there anything else you'd like to read from the book? Any passages you marked?
No, actually, the ones that came up spontaneously were, I think, really illustrative of the style of the book. And I just really can't speak highly enough. I've read this book many times now, from as a 6-year-old looking through the pictures and then reading it again at different times throughout my life. And as I was rereading it to write the introduction, I was amazed by how much I saw in a new way or learn for the first time. So whether you read the book long ago or it's new to you, I would encourage anyone who is interested enough to tune in tonight to spend some time with it, because it really is just a wonderful story, and full of endless connections, unexpected kinds of connections to more contemporary events. And it is so fascinating to see how things have unfolded from the foundations that we see laid out there.
Ben, I just want to ask, I mean, obviously this person, your uncle, had a tremendous influence on your life. Did he have everything to do with the fact that he became a Buddhist scholar? How did that happen?
I was always interested in Buddhism, largely because I knew about this Buddhist uncle. He was the first person who taught me seated meditation practice, certainly. And in terms of becoming a scholar, I often think back to a moment when the two of us were on this pilgrimage in Sikkim. So I was 18 years old and had just met Chatrul Rinpoche, who to me seemed like a Buddha in person. And I was full of enthusiasm and devotion. And I said to my uncle, there's no way I'm going back to America to go back to college. What a waste of a precious human birth. I've got one chance. I'm going to go do a 3-year retreat and just focus on, complete awakening. And he really urged me against that path. And he said, in Tibet, that might make sense. In Tibet, you finish a 3-year retreat and the community recognizes what that means, and people will, provide you with your sustenance and your food, and there's certain respect that goes along with that. He said, in America, we don't really have a culture yet that supports people in that path. And he said, I've known a lot of people who have devoted themselves fully, in that way that you're describing, to long retreats, and then end up not quite knowing how they fit into contemporary society in the US. And sometimes it's a struggle to have a livelihood. Sometimes people feel unappreciated and bitter. And he said, you're really interested in this academic stuff too, the history and learning the languages and studying and translating. Why don't you go the academic route and, maintain your connection with Buddhism there? And as an 18-year-old, I argued, we had a real argument about it. And I said, if I do that, if I go study for PhD, it's going to, dry up all of the kind of juicy energy I have around my connection to this as a living tradition. And I'm going to end up this arrogant, sad academic sitting in my office. So we went back and forth about that. And as I reflect back on it, I think there are some days when I think I was right, actually. But there are other days, better days, when I think he was right, that there is a way to sort of maintain both a connection to the living tradition and a place in the lineage, and pursue academic study, and teaching in college classroom is absolutely, a wonderful livelihood, and something that I feel very grateful that he encouraged me in that direction. So.
Well, all that juicy energy found its way into the introduction. It is really wonderful. I learned things I hadn't known. Just one other question. Rick might have made a great scholar, but he left Harvard under strange circumstances. It sounds so quaint nowadays. Why don't you tell us what happened?
Yeah, maybe that'll be a little tease for people to get the introduction so they can read the story. But he was expelled from Harvard in the late 60s as a result of being arrested for the crime of fornication. And that really does date this and make you realize how much things have changed. That at the time, fornication, sex out of wedlock was illegal, and that he was actually arrested for that, and that led to his eventual expulsion from Harvard. And when he left Harvard, he then went to New York, and that's where he kind of befriended the beat poets, and a lifelong friendship with Allen Ginsberg and other figures in that crowd. So I think in a sense, it was probably a lucky turn of events for American Buddhism. But again, another strange difficulty in his own path.
Yeah, I didn't know about that, and Helen never told me about that, so I never heard about it. It's something like you don't hear about from the older generations so much, so it's very funny.
Yeah, it was something that he wrote about a number of times. So I based my accounts of that both on, he kept all of the official letters, including the letter of appeal that he wrote as a young college student, in which he acknowledged the fact that he had committed the alleged act, but that he did not think that it was criminal. And he made a defense of that, which is just amazing to read today. You know, someone.
Yeah, if
arguing.
he hadn't fought it, he might have stayed. Didn't he fall asleep in a biology exam or something? And that was the last straw, I think.
That was the last straw. Yeah, yeah. There were other factors, but that was the one that set the whole.
Such a colorful character, right?
Yes.
So I think we have time for questions. Our hosts are coming back. Hi, Rachel.
All right, we do indeed have some audience questions. And audience members, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please type them into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we will post them for you. The first one came in anonymously, someone asking, does this book inform your teaching?
Yeah, I think it does inform my teaching in certain ways. I mean, it was in my own sort of entry into the world of Buddhism, this was really a foundational text. So it really sort of set the path. I don't teach, I have not yet taught any courses on Buddhism in America in particular, although that comes up from time to time in my classes. But my own research and teaching are more focused on the traditional Buddhism of the Himalayas. So I've never taught this book per se, and I don't particularly teach this subject, but in a broader sense, it absolutely has influenced me.
I believe you guys have addressed William's question, who said the original book was criticized for largely ignoring the Asian American Buddhist organizations. Has this been addressed? And I feel like we definitely covered that. But Gaetano has a suggestion. Ben, he says, Ben, maybe offer to read the preface about the section of the preface about Dai Bosatsu Zindo.
I would be delighted. So the book opens with a particular moment, and this was in 1976 when the largest traditional Japanese style Zen monastery in America was consecrated, and this gives you a sense of the book. It's called Attention, Preface to the Assembly. The sesshin began like every other sesshin, with the deep hollow sound of the bell, and it continued for 7 days like every other sesshin, with alternating periods of sitting and walking, eating formally in the zendo, working for short periods at manual labor, sanzen with the roshi, and a few hours of sleep. But instead of one roshi, like most sesshins, this one had more than 20 roshis and dharma teachers in attendance. Concluding on July 4th, 1976, this session had been held to mark the opening of Dai Bosatsu, the first traditional Japanese-style Zen monastery in America. Richard Baker Roshi had come from San Francisco for the opening ceremony, Sasaki Roshi and Maizumi Roshi from Los Angeles, Takeda Roshi from Mexico City, and Philip Kaplo Roshi from Rochester. Sung-san, not a Japanese or American Zen master, but a Korean Zen master, had come up from Providence, and there was even a large contingent of visiting Roshis from Japan. There was even a Tibetan who had incorporated certain aspects of Zen into his teaching, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the 11th Trungpa Tulku, not wearing his best robes like the Roshis, but a dark suit of English cut. And then it concludes, I'll skip ahead a bit. The ceremony was broken by thunderstorms and went on into the night around a raging bonfire where the water of wisdom, otherwise known as sake, flowed freely. Meanwhile, in New York City, a fleet of schooners sailed up the East River to celebrate the bicentennial, and Dudram Rinpoche, the head of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, who had just arrived in the country, addressed the FM radio audience on a WBAI program, In the Spirit, that claimed more than 78,900 listeners. While another wing of Buddhism, the Soka Gakkai, 2,000 strong, paraded down Fifth Avenue with their marching band. Nobody was sure what all this Buddhist activity meant on the 4th of July bicentennial, a mere 200 years after the United States of America had been founded. But it was clear to all the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arhats, lay people, and Japanese tourists who had gathered together to inaugurate Dai Bosatsu Zendo in the Catskills that this was only the beginning. And so that moment on July 4th, on the bicentennial, where he highlights, all of this Buddhist activity that was happening on that day, really does embody the way in which the book is a portrait of America and of Buddhism in the ways that they converged. And that particular event at Dai Bosatsu Zendo, but also the other activity around New York City on that day, it really evokes that. It's also, when I read it now, and he says, oh, isn't it amazing this Buddhist was on the radio with 78,000 people listening? I mean, that's just dwarfed by the numbers of people who listen to Buddhist podcasts or are engaged in Buddhist activity. You can see how much it's grown, that was such an impressive number 40 years ago. And now, we see much, much larger numbers of people tuning into American Buddhist goings on.
Fascinating, thank you. Brad asked, can you talk about Rick's fight with cancer, please? Since I find some of his writings very insightful.
Yeah, that was personally, a very inspiring experience to see Rick's, how he faced his cancer. Again, similar to his approach to Buddhism, where he didn't seize onto one tradition as being the only true way. He drew upon, Lakota healing ceremonies and South American shamanic traditions and traditional Chinese medicine and Tibetan Buddhist practice and every manner of chemotherapy and radiation therapy and stem cell therapy. Anything he could get his hands on, he was willing to try if it was gonna help. And there's a wonderful interview with him in Tricycle magazine again about his experience with cancer. With Helen Tworkov, and that's where some of the poems were taken out. And his approach, again, he had this sort of fierce sense of not being willing to take anybody's arrogant sense that they knew the answer to something. There's a story that a particular oncologist said to him, I don't think you realize here, you're not really fully accepting the fact that you have a life-threatening disease. And he turned to the oncologist and said, I think you're not accepting the fact that I have a disease-threatening life. And he, said, look, you don't know, don't tell me how long I'm going to live. I might walk out the door of the hospital and get hit by a bus, or you might get hit by a bus walking in the hospital. None of us knows when we're going to die. And as long as I'm alive, I'm going to try and live as fully as possible. And so, his original prognosis, the doctors had said, there's really no point doing treatment of any kind. The cancer was so far as stage 4, had spread so far. And they said, your quality of life is going to be really affected and you shouldn't do it. But he said, no, I'm not really ready yet. And so he did, as I mentioned, all these therapies and spent much of he lived for 5 years after that, and much of that time in remission, and was very active writing the book of poems. He was still editor of Yoga Journal at the time, getting married. He did a lot of things during those last 5 years of his life. And in a way, I would almost think that he approached it sort of fearlessly, but he actually, to the contrary, spoke a lot about the fear he experienced. And so there's a sense in which sort of acknowledging and being present with that fear was a big part of the way that he lived through that. And definitely in my own memory and my own experience, when I would visit him during those years, there was a sense in which, in one of the poems in that book, he writes, isn't it amazing how everything shines in the light of death? And there was a way in which that's a big part of the Buddhist teachings as well, as this reflection on impermanence, and that there can be a clarifying way in which recognizing the reality of impermanence and reality of death can shift the way we perceive the present moment. And he really did live in that sort of illuminated clarity during the final years of his life. He had been practicing meditation for decades and decades, but the presence of death sort of intensified that in the end. So I hope that's helpful in trying to answer that question.
Thank you, Ben. There's another question from Brad here. He says, very interesting point about Rick not seeing any one tradition as the one true way. Can you speak about Rick's relationship to psychedelics and also to the beats?
Yes. So in both cases, and there was some overlap, of course, between the beats and psychedelics. Rick has written about those things, better than I could summarize it. Those again in an essay in Tricycle, which was reprinted in a book called Zigzag Zen, I believe, which is about psychedelics and Buddhism. He wrote about the relationship between psychedelics and Buddhism and seeing them as potentially complementary in different ways. Not, of course, without their dangers, but that there could be benefits to thinking about these things together. And many of the most important beat poets, I would mention Allen Ginsberg, Anne Waldman, Gary Snyder, were very, very close friends of Rick's. They worked closely together at Naropa Institute and the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics that Anne Waldman and Allen Ginsberg founded together, and Rick occasionally lectured and taught there. And so his approach to poetic practice and the connection between meditation and poetics was very directly influenced by the beat movement and that particular branch of the beats that became so closely connected with Buddhism and Buddhist practice in Boulder and Naropa Institute with Anne Waldman and Allen Ginsberg.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. We need to wrap up. But Ben and James, thank you. This has been a really fascinating evening. We've enjoyed it tremendously. Audience, thank you for being here. You can order How the Swans Came to the Lake from Northshire at northshire.com. And while you're there, you can also check out our great list of other upcoming events. We hope that you'll join us for another event soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great seeing you, Ben.
Great to see you, James. Thank you.
Thank you and good night, everybody.